Hi, everybody. Graduation time. We're up to 3 balloons now, and we haven't even got the 6th graders out yet. So, yeah. I always can tell when there's some special thing going on because there's balloons up in the rafters that we haven't yet brought down. That's just happened in the last few days. That was last week. So, graduation time around these here places. Usually I'm down in my office before, coming down here for the study. And tonight I had a chance to sit in for the last couple of songs and worship. And, man, it sounded good. So, if you've been here for any length of time, Dale and Steve have been coming and doing worship with us for a long time. But then they added Sharon when she kind of came up and started saying, okay, yeah, I'll play cello. That's cool. And then Robert has the stand-up bass. Where'd Robert go? Did he run off? Okay, he's walking in. So he has that big stand-up bass, and then they added that sound to it, and it just sounded really good. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate that. Yeah, really cool. So I'm getting the evil eye from Danny. He's like, yeah, but man, I have to mix the sound. So where's the love? All right. I wasn't complimenting the sound ministry. I was complimenting the musicians. But okay, Thank you, Danny. So, yeah, there you go. That's cool. So it did, it did. It just sounded really good. So, let me throw that out there to everyone as well. Putting together something like that, it's not like they just 5 minutes before they get here. So, what songs do you guys want to do? There's a lot of thought that goes into it. So, between the two groups that we have leading worship, there are a lot of people that will kind of come and do, vocals and things like that. But if you have a gift for music, and it's something that you'd be interested in, trust me, it's not that we've got, way too many people and no room for you. There's plenty of room. So if you play an instrument or if you sing and you do that and you'd be interested, come on and let us know. Now, I've always joked if, there are some things that I don't know that we could possibly work in. If you play like a mouth harp, that little doing, doing, doing thing, I don't know how we'd work that out. But, we'll I suppose what? Ed'll find a way to make that work. Big band Sundays. Oh my gosh. For those of you who are new here, sorry. Every once in a while we'll just have some fun with things. But where we are tonight in the text, we're in the book of Exodus at chapter 18. And where we get to tonight it really is an incredibly pivotal time in the text, because what we get to in chapter 19 is the beginnings of what God is going to do by making them a covenant people. And it is impossible to overstate the importance of what will take place by the time that chapter 19 is completed, because it's going to change entirely God's interaction with the people, because what he is going to do is give them a codified or a written law, and they will have to abide by that because they will have said, yes, we'll do that. Chapter 18, very interesting, kind of just like almost like a parenthetical. It's just like right in the middle of everything. He adds in chapter 18, and we're introduced once again to Jethro. Now, Jethro, we would already know about him because of chapter 3 of Exodus. This is the father of his wife, Moses' wife, and he's been left in care of Moses' wife and his 2 children. And so we know a little bit about him, but we get more information about Jethro in this chapter than we have in the other ones, and pretty much everything up to this point. Pretty interesting guy. We don't know a great deal about him, but a kind of a fascinating guy. And many of us, if we've studied the Bible at all, we would know that he's this priest of Midian. But where is Midian, and what does Midian mean, and all that stuff? I'll explain a little bit of that tonight. So chapter 18 of Exodus, let's turn there, and let's have a word of prayer. Father, as we come to your word this evening, we pray that you would give us understanding in our hearts and our minds. As we come to your word, we ask that you, by your Holy Spirit, would help us to understand not just the history of this, but why that history matters. And so we ask, Lord, that you would speak to us through your word and help us to understand the reasons why these things are written for us, that we could understand the truths behind them. And so we give you all thanks, and we give you praise and honor this evening as we come before you. We give you all of our lives and our hopes, and pray, God, that you would have your perfect will done in each of us. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen? All right, so chapter 18 begins this way. In verse 1, and Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and Israel, his people, that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Let's just deal with Midian. If you're not familiar with the actual title of Midian, Midian was one of the sons of Keturah. So all the way back to Abraham and Keturah, his wife, after Hagar and after Sarah. So here's the important part of that. Midian, being one of the sons, went and lived in a part of the world, Saudi Arabia, as we would consider it, right on the shores or right coming up to the Red Sea. From your perspective, the Red Sea is that large body of water, and then it breaks into two fingers. And the part here is what we would call the Sinai, or the Sinai Peninsula, is along where the water is. So on this side would be Saudi Arabia, and Midian is the coastal area and then inland from that. So that's where the son of Abraham went to live. And so there's this interesting division that happens historically. You figure that from the times even of Cain, that he would have traveled east as he left. And so you have the same things, whether it's Esau or Ishmael, all of them moved, even Keturah and all of the family. There was that split that happened between the sons of Abraham and the descendants, or even of Cain and of Seth. After Abel had died or was killed by Cain, another son comes along, Seth, and he stays pretty much in the area where they were, but eastward is where all of the, eastward for me, eastward for you. That's where all of them would have gone after their departure, if you will. In chapter 18, and then for sure into 19, is where you begin to see the kind of coming back together of the two sides. Kind of an interesting thing. It's very subtle. You don't necessarily see it right away. But what you find represented in this man Jethro is that part of the family that split off, if you will, from Ishmael's time all the way over towards the east. And so here we see that part introduced, and now the bringing back together of those two lines. So, kind of a fascinating thing when you stop to consider it in those terms. So we see in verse 2, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back. So you get that from Exodus chapter 4. And that was where he was going to be doing the things in Egypt. Remember what has happened. Chapter 3, I'm sorry, I think I said a little bit earlier, I mentioned chapter 3. That's where Moses first has the burning bush discussions with God. So it's not unusual that he's done this. By chapter 4, he's done the things, or he's about to do the things that God has asked him to do and go back to Egypt. His whole contest with Pharaoh and all of that stuff begins at chapter 4. And starting at verse 18, after he has already married Zipporah and had his children, he leaves her and the children with Jethro, her father, and goes and does all of what he's doing. So all these chapters later, he's had his contest with Pharaoh. They've come across the Red Sea, and they've gone from place to place. Now he's about to get the law, and Jethro comes with his wife and their children and meets him close to where Moses will receive the law. So that's where we are in the narrative, about 3 months in after the Exodus. So at verse 3 it says, now he brings his wife after he had sent her back, verse 3, with her 2 sons, of whom one name was Gershom, which is said being a stranger in a foreign land. That's the meaning of his name. And the name of the other was Eleazar, for he had said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Now Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. So all the way back to the very beginning of things, sometimes you will hear it mentioned, the mountain of God is Horeb or Sinai, Mount Sinai, meaning the same thing. Now, if you were to try to ask somebody where exactly did this take place, it's like when we go to the places there in Israel. You know, where you hear Mount Carmel or Mount Hermon or the Golan Heights, those mountains there. It's mountain ranges. So which actual peak was it? Which hill was it? You don't know for sure. It's impossible to say. But you know the area where it is, and so where it took place is kind of irrelevant. You don't have to know it, but you know, like with Mount Hermon in the north of Israel, there are a number of different peaks, but it's referred to as Mount Hermon. So same kind of a situation here. If somebody was to try to say, this is the exact spot where the burning bush was, and this is the exact spot where he got the law, the exact spot, you can't say that. But you know where it is. And so it's not difficult, it's not a stretch to at least know that part. So, now he, that being Jethro, said to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down, and kissed him. And they asked each other about their well-being, and they went into the tent. So there's the meeting, everybody sees it. Now they're going to go talk about things, find out about how are things going and what's been taking place. So Jethro's side of it, well, since you left, here's what's been going on with your wife and your kids and who knows whatever else. Moses, on the other hand, has a whole lot to tell. There's some interesting things that have transpired. So Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. So then Jethro rejoiced for all the good which the Lord had done for Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, for in this very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them all. Now, the one thing we don't know about, of course, we know where he comes from. We know why it's named. We know who Midian was. We know that there would have certainly been an understanding who the God of Abraham was, right? These are the descendants. Midian are the descendants of Abraham through his children with Keturah. So it's not as though the God of Israel would be foreign to them. So it makes perfect sense that Jethro would have had that same understanding. It's not as though the God of Israel would have been a foreign God to him. But again, we don't know a whole lot, but his testimony here is that he's above all gods. Now, did he come to this realization only because of what Moses had said? I doubt it. Because again, it's not like this would have been something new to them. The generations would have known this had it been handed down. Again, it's all things that we don't know an awful lot about. But he makes the statement that he does. So it tells us in verse 12, Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and other sacrifices to offer to God, and Aaron came with the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. Now it's curious because notice Moses is not mentioned in this. In Moses, this was something that was pointed out that I thought was kind of interesting. In Aaron and the children of Israel, what you have are the direct descendants of Abraham through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the sons of Jacob. You have that line that God had promised all the way back to Genesis 12. So they represent that pure line done the way that God had wanted. Through the sons that came through Abraham and through Sarah, the people that God wanted, and that's the line, though God still blessed and kept his promises through Abraham and then through Ishmael and through Esau and those sons that were not the sons of promise per se. They were the ones that were not going to keep that line. These were the ones that had moved east, but yet here they are represented. So they're represented in the person of Jethro. So here you have the two sides, if you will, of the same bloodline, but through different sons. I don't know if you find that fascinating. I certainly do. Moses would have been kind of a bridge between them because he's married into the Midianite family through Zipporah and Jethro being his father-in-law. But, of course, he's a descendant directly of Abraham through the people that were raised up there in Egypt. Now, an interesting thing also, when you think Midian, these are also the people who originally, here's an irony for you, they're the people who originally purchased Joseph from his brothers, right? And then they sold him to Egypt. Potiphar in particular, and that's where Joseph comes, and then that's what led them all into Egypt in the first place. Isn't that weird? And so here it is all kind of brought back together. Kind of an interesting little, historical event. And now here they are sitting down at a table. And they've got a feast, and the lines kind of come together. It's a pretty fascinating thing. Now, verse 13 says, "Now, so it was on the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. And so when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did for the people, he said, 'What is this thing that you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit, and the people stand before you from morning until evening?'" So here's the spectacle of it. Moses, needless to say, is the person that God has been communicating with. It's clear. But if you've got what are hundreds of thousands of people, clearly, some would say well into the millions, but when you take out the idea of the people who would be coming on behalf of the families, let's just say tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people may very well want Moses' counsel. Can you imagine that line? It's like, go take a number and go stand in line and wait. So he's kind of adjudicating, and he's hearing all these different things that are needing of the people. And so he's listening to it, and he's giving this counsel to them, things that he is to take to the Lord for them. Impossible to see it all. And so here's Jethro watching this whole thing and thinking, this is crazy. One guy dealing with all those people from morning till night, hearing nothing but those needs. And certainly by the end of the day, he hasn't gotten to the end of it all. So he watches all of this. And so Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did for the people. And he said, "What is this thing that you do for the people? Why do you sit alone, and the people standing before you from morning until evening?" And then Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God." So this mediation that's going on. Totally off subject, but this is, again, an interesting thing, because at this point people understood that there was a level of mediation. And so here we are in the 21st century, and sometimes I think we take it for granted that this idea of mediation is no longer necessary. We don't have to go to a human being. We don't have to go to a priest. We don't have to go to a church. We don't have to go anywhere other than directly before Jesus, the one who mediates and comes before and brings us before the Father himself. So we are able to come to the Lord either through his word, directly through prayer and seeking God's counsel and his guidance. It just shows you how different things are now, that sometimes we, I think, may miss the idea that we are given direct access in the person of Jesus, one mediator. Well, here we see in verse 16, "And so when they have a difficulty," Moses goes on, "they come to me, and I judge between one and another, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws." And so Moses' father-in-law said to him, "This thing that you do is not good." Now, is it bad that they would want to have counsel? Of course not. Would Moses be the likely person that they would inquire of the things of God? Absolutely, no question. Can it all be done by one guy on behalf of an entire nation? Not hardly. So it's not a good thing for you, for them. This isn't really serving necessarily the purpose of things. Now, you'll notice that if you've ever had a chance to get to Israel, you'll notice that when they do excavations of cities, they always find the place where even this continued on through those years of the kingdom, where whatever city it was, there would be the elders that would sit in the gates and do exactly what we hear Moses was doing here. You certainly hope that these guys had the ear of the Lord, because it would be pretty bad to go get counsel from a guy who has bad counsel to give. But this sets kind of an understanding that there would be those people who would judge over these affairs. Well, and so in verse 18, the counsel that he continues to give to Moses is this: "Both you and these people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out. For this thing is too much for you, and you are not able to perform it by yourself. Listen now to my voice, and I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. Stand before God for the people, so that you may bring difficulties to God. And you will teach them these statutes and these laws, and show them the way which they must walk and work that they must do. Moreover, select from all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. Now you'll notice this is a pretty interesting thing because it should sound somewhat familiar to you in a New Testament sense. Anybody thinking what I'm thinking? The idea of how is it that you would take care of the needs of people. We see a similar thing employed. I'll tell you about it in just a moment if you're not necessarily tracking. It's in Acts chapter 6. But more importantly here, notice what he says. You go and inquire of the Lord on the big things, but on the little things, find men to do this. Now notice what he ends up saying of them, of their character. It's not just grab the ones that everybody goes to, not just the smartest, not just the, whatever reason you would go to a person and say, he seems like a perfect person for a judge. Notice that there are qualifications that are very, very important. They're said again in verse 21. These are able men. Here are the qualifications. Do they have a fear for the things of God? Do they have a reverence for him? That's the first of the qualifications that are mentioned. Are these truthful men? Are they trustworthy? Are they truthful? Are they also ones who hate covetousness? Because it may very well be that there might be something in it for them, depending on how they judge. Are they covetous? Are they going to judge in such a way that somehow is to their benefit? And then it says, and then place them to be rulers of thousands and hundreds and tens and like that. Now, what an interesting, series, if you will, of qualifications. Now, that's not necessarily going to be an easy thing, I guess, to find. And so think about it if we chose our politicians like this. Wouldn't that be nice? For a change? And so I mentioned it this morning about, how do you go about voting and all the rest of that? We have primaries happening a week from this Tuesday. It's a big deal. Can you imagine if right now you could just wave your hand and immediately all of the people who didn't fit these qualifications would be disqualified? Something would happen and they have to bow out of the race. We wouldn't have anybody running anymore. So, interesting. Well, this is what was expected. Now let's get back to the Acts chapter 6. Remember what that was there at the time. Now remember, that's just in the church. That's just in Jerusalem. It's a much smaller group of people. And yet the dispute became of what they would call the Hellenists. And these were the people who had come into belief, but they were not Jewish, but they had come into this belief and they were part of the church, and they felt that their widows were being ignored in the distribution of needs and food and stuff like that. So they came to the disciples with this problem. The disciples get brilliant counsel that I'm sure God gave them, just as I'm sure he gave it also here to Jethro, and that ultimately Moses follows. I believe it was of the Lord that this took place. But remember the qualifications in Acts chapter 6. Make sure that these are men of integrity. Make sure that they're among your own people. Are they filled with the Spirit? Are they people that have a good reputation? Are they filled with wisdom? So if that's the case, remember what was being asked of them to do. Distribution of food and the deal of tables, making sure that things are given in the way that they're supposed to do. Something that to us might seem trivial. And yet for trivial matters, they had to have those qualifications. That's pretty amazing if you stop to think about it. Who's going to make sure that people get the things that they need equally in the distribution? Well, I don't know. First of all, make sure that they meet those qualifications. If somebody sees them in place of that, are they going to roll their eyes? Because, oh my gosh, they put that guy in charge? He's not of good reputation. Don't they know what that guy's like? Or he lacks wisdom. My goodness, every single decision's the wrong one. Or filled with the Spirit. That guy wouldn't know what God's will is if it ran him over in a truck. So think of all of the qualifications that were necessary for something that we would think is totally trivial. In this case, look who it is that's going to adjudicate the small matters, and the big deals are going to come through Moses, but the day-to-day things have to have this level of character. So again, I think it's a hugely important thing for us. And it just seems to be, here's an interesting thing. It seems like whenever we're in a text and something kind of comes to the top, it's happening just about every single Bible study that we do around here. The text is always speaking about such things. Notice this morning when we were looking at Zephaniah, And the idea that God calls his people to be a cut way above the rest, that they're to be different and distinguishable from the rest of the world. Same thing right here. Even among the children of Israel, the ones that God had brought them all out as a collective group, whoever's going to minister to them needs to stand out above them all. And so just in these, what would seem as trivial matters, they've got to be a cut above. Verse 22. So let them judge the people at all times, and then it will be that every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they themselves will judge. And so it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. Now, let's make sure that we're careful when we see it'll be easier for you, that that's never the reason why we do something. The fact that you would call yourself a believer proves that you're not doing the easy thing. Can we agree with that? Now, it's funny when the people in the world love to mock the Christian. Oh, you people, all you do is just do whatever the Bible says, as though that's something easy. Right? Isn't that funny? I get a kick out of that, and every once in a while I get a chance to interact with a person like that. And it's great to be able to compare notes and say, hey, I'll tell you what, for 20 years of my life, I did what you do. That's easy. Get up in the morning, do whatever you want, live by the dictates of your own conscience, whatever that may mean. I can get out of bed every single morning a sinner and just do whatever sinners do. It's natural. It's simple. I'll tell you what's difficult. Do what God asks you to do and deny yourself. So, yeah, go ahead and mock us for our Christianity and for doing what the Bible tells us to do. Go ahead, mock away. Just try it for a day. Hilarious. Anyway, just because it's easy is not a good reason necessarily to follow. In this case, it will be easier, it'll be less of a demand on you and less of a demand on the people, and the things that you desire to do will be able to be done on behalf of all of the people. So with this, the ease was a good thing. Now, if you do this thing, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all the people also will be able to go to their place in peace. So Moses heeded the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. And Moses chose able men out of all of Israel, made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, and of 50s, and of 10s. And so they judged the people at all times. The hard cases they brought to Moses, but they judged every small matter themselves. And Moses let his father-in-law depart, and then he went his way back to his own land. Now, how long that took, no saying. But notice that there's nothing about this that Moses tried it and it blew up in his face and he had to go back to the way that things were. See, this was good counsel. Now, at this point, Sinai, remember? Sinai Peninsula, this is the area where they are. Midian would have been on this side, but he would have had to go over the tip of that finger of the Red Sea. Doesn't say how long it took, none of that stuff. He just went back to where he came from. We know the general area, the city or wherever else doesn't tell us. It tells us that he went back to the area of where he lived, Midian. Now, chapter 19 transitions us to a point in the text that I honestly can't tell you just how important of a change this is. So here is what has happened in, let's say, the major figures that we know in the history of Israel. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the sons. There's that time of the 400 years that we know very little, if any, of the history of Israel, and then along comes Moses. All of these people were given promises, and God had led them, though he didn't do it by writing it down in a book. It was a direct communication, and so they walked accordingly. These were people that would hear what God wanted them to do, and then they had that choice. Do I do this or do I not do this? I'll walk, I'll trust, and I'll do because God has said so, and so they walk by faith. We call that faith, right? God says something, we have the option. Do we do it or not? And if we say we will do that, why? Well, because the one who's asked me is worthy of my trust. Because he has been faithful every time that he's made a promise, he's followed through on that promise. We call that faith. What they're about to get is the covenant of the law. Not just the Ten Commandments, but everything that follows thereafter. Chapter 19 is that transition of time. So let's make sure we understand this. It's no small matter. To this point, it is we walk by faith. God has said things verbally, and he has led. Now he's about to put it in writing what it is that he expects of us. Now that still requires faith. You still have to believe that this is what God is leading you to do, and you walk accordingly, no question. But this will be the first time that God has said, now write this down because here are some specifics and this is what you're expected to do. Do this, don't do that, right? That's what's going to come from this. So chapter 19 is that point in time when God is going to say, now it's according to the law. When you look at Psalm 19, verse 7, David says, the law of the Lord is pure, it's perfect, converting the soul. Now, I read the law, and I realize it is exactly what God had intended, no question. He gives you the specifics of all of what he expects. But when you read the law, does anybody feel that it's a converting thing for the soul? Me, personally, I feel condemned by it. Why? Because God gives you a standard of perfection. And I am really good about recognizing how imperfect I am when I start to read the law. To David, who would have said that, no question, that it had that effect on him, that it brought him from one place to another. So that idea of converting, or at least it brings us to the Lord. Now, that's all that David would have known. That was the world in which he lived. There was the law. He found a beauty in it, as do I. At the same time, I recognize that God says, but that standard has to be held to perfectly, never failing in the law. And at that point, it goes from that converting the soul to, I'm such a sinner. Which is exactly what Galatians 3 tells us it was intended to do. Right? So Paul would reckon with the people in Galatia of chapter 3. It starts around verse 20, 21, somewhere thereabouts. And he talks about the law and says, he's trying to tell the people, you can't perfect yourself by keeping the law. But does that mean that God doesn't care about the law itself? Of course not. But it was all part of what God had planned. There would be that time of the law where people would say, God, I know that you have a standard, but I just can't hold to that standard. So Paul would reason with the Galatians and say, yeah, but that's because the law was, if you will, a schoolmaster or a tutor for us, that it would bring us to Jesus. That we would come to him and say, I know that this is what's expected of me, but I can't do this. To which Jesus would say, I'm here as a fulfillment of all of the law. Put your trust and your faith in me because I've kept it perfectly. So someone was found capable and able to keep the entirety of the law, and therefore everything fell upon him. He was judged in our place. Our faith is now put back into him. So here we've come full circle. With Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, all the way to Moses, up until the time of the law, people had walked with God by faith. In comes the law, and they had the guidelines that are all there. And in the person of Jesus who kept them all, we're back to the place of faith. Now, know this, that because God did take the time to write it down and it's codified, anyone who has rejected Jesus and his forgiveness that is offered through his blood will stand before God and they will be measured according to the law. It's there. It's in writing. They will never be able to measure up. And even if someone would be able to, and there are, believe it or not, I've heard them, people that would say, according to the law, they're blameless, they're perfect. Tough. Flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom of God. So your own righteousness is not going to be enough to get you into heaven anyway. You still need to come to Jesus because a sacrifice must be made. Okay, so chapter 19. Now, in the 3rd month, after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. Now, they've already been in this area. Now, they've been working their way towards it. And they had departed from Rephidim, and they had come to the wilderness of Sinai, and they had camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain. Now, let's remember what's taken place, the chronology of things. This is where the Lord first met with Moses, the burning bush, chapter 3. I need you to go to Pharaoh. And here's what I need you to do. You need to tell him he needs to let my people go because they're going to come back to this place. So everything that we see that started in chapter 3 is bringing them to this time. And all of the things in between is leading them to this occasion and what took place here at Horeb or Sinai. Because it is now about the giving of the law. And so, after he's done exactly what God had said, he goes to Egypt, has his contest with Pharaoh, even with all of his objections of why he couldn't do it. God still uses him, brings them across the Red Sea. Now they find themselves in Sinai. They're back to the place where he had first received the instruction to go and do this. Now he's there for the second, if you will, set of instructions. Now you're going to receive the codified law. beginning with the commandments and then all the things that happen thereafter, which will really lead us through the rest of the books that we study here. Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the rest of Exodus. All based upon what takes place here. So please understand the importance of what we're reading here. It's huge. So, verse 3. So Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you will say to the house of Jacob, and you will tell the children of Israel, I have a message for the people. Here's what that message is. Verse 4, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you out of with eagle's wings, brought you to myself. Now, he takes credit for everything that has happened to this, and he should. Obviously, they did nothing to part the waters themselves, did they? They didn't bring about the plagues. They didn't do any such thing. And they have been brought to this place, and God reminds them of who it was that had done it. Now, here's a question. Why would God need to remind them of this? Because we humans are really slow on such things, and after time we tend to be forgetful, and somehow maybe even try to take credit for the things that only God could do. So he reminds them, just remind the people of who it was that brought you to where you are. Now, therefore, he says in verse 5, since that's the case, I've brought you to this place, I've done all the miraculous things, now here is what you need to know. If, it's a qualifier, hugely important. Now there are those people that would say God is the one who decrees everything, and without him, nothing would ever take place because God's the one who picks and chooses all things. Then why the qualifiers? Why if? It's a stipulation. If you will do this. So if you will indeed obey my voice and, in addition, keep my covenant, then what will happen is that you will be a special treasure to me above all people. Now, why would he be able to say something like that? Because the earth is mine. But once again, as we do every time we run into one of these verses, I think it's important, and especially in the Old Testament, because most of those people that say God picks and chooses, he makes every decision, you have no free will, you have none of that kind of stuff, most every time it's really based on, I don't know, half a dozen New Testament verses that they'll quote, and yet they'll forget stuff like this that's so clear that Moses says, look, here's the offer, or God says to Moses, here's the offer. But here's the contingencies. If you will do this, puts it on to them. Now, at this point, when they hear all this, notice how eager they are to say, everything that the Lord said is great, we'll do it. Okay, we'll see. Now, we have the ability of hindsight to look back and say, so how did they do? Well, we're going to study the rest of it. We're going to see what happens. But initially, they say we're in. So, he's going to roll this out, if you will, as he begins to reveal these things to Moses, starting with the Ten Commandments. And then so many things that will happen as we study through the book where God begins to reveal more and more. Here's what's acceptable. Here's what you're supposed to do. Now, notice again, verse 5. If you will indeed obey my voice, first thing. And then keep the covenant. Now, hearing the things that he says, then following the things that will be codified and written thereafter, then you will be a special treasure to me above all people, for the earth is mine. Now, some people see in this a contradiction in what Peter has to say. Let's go ahead and take a look there in 1 Peter chapter 2. And what you'll notice, there's a couple of parties, if you will, who look at what Peter has to say here in 1 Peter chapter 2. It starts at verse 9. They notice a similarity in the words in some ways, and then they jump to some conclusions that are completely unmerited. There's no reason why they should. Here are the two factions that take one verse and they try to adapt what you see in Exodus and make them the covenant people of Exodus 19. Let me show you where the problem comes in. Here's what Peter has to say, and then I'll tell you about who the factions are. Verse 9, but you are a chosen generation. You are a royal priesthood and a holy nation, his own special people. Stop right there. That sounds very similar to what you see that we read in chapter 19 of Exodus. The factions are these. Those that would say all of the promises made to Israel are now given to the church because Israel had rejected Jesus when he came. Therefore, all of the promises to Israel are now given to the church. Hogwash. That's about the best word I can come up for it. Then there are those other people that say, see right here, we're supposed to be a church filled with priests. And it's supposed to be a priesthood who leads the church. Now, of course, that too is nonsense. That too is hogwash, because what were the limitations of the last priesthood? It was dominated by men who were sinful, who could never mediate on behalf of man, because the problem was that when people would come to the priest and say, here, offer before God because I've got things that I need to renounce and need forgiveness of and need repentance, oftentimes the priest would be worse than they were. Same problem today. So here's what's just amazing to me, that people would actually believe that Jesus came to nullify and perfect the idea of a priesthood. That's why he's our great high priest who has gone on our behalf before the throne room of God directly and paid the price for sin, because the priesthood of man could never, ever possibly do the things necessary to mediate between God and man. So the idea that Jesus would come and fulfill the Levitical priesthood perfectly and then reestablish a brand new priesthood based on all the same failings makes no sense whatsoever. It's absurd on its face. And yet, think of how many people there are who believe that that's exactly what Jesus did. And they'll use passages like this. But notice where it completely falls apart for both of those groups. Read the rest. After he says, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but now are a people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. So what you recognize here is that this is a new entity entirely. It's not that one supersedes the other. It's that God had a covenant with the people of Israel through this Mosaic covenant, the people of the law. And then he has a covenant now that is side by side. God still has much to do with the nation of Israel, and we'll see it roll out more and more as time goes by. But he hasn't nullified all of the promises all the way back to Genesis 12. That was a forever promise made to Abraham. And yet, we know that there is a covenant that's been made in the blood of Jesus with the church, and it's made up of Jew and Gentile and every walk of life that there is. So, side by side. It's not an either or. So, we see in verse 7, back in Exodus 19, so Moses came and he called for the elders of the people, and he laid before them all the words which the Lord had commanded. Now, let's remember the words that were commanded to them were big things. I'm going to make you a nation. You're going to be a people to me if you do these things. Now, these things are going to be explained as we go. There's much that's going to be added in content. But I'll roll that stuff out as we go. So Moses comes back and gives them that detail. And then all the people, verse 8, answered together, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. So Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. Now, can you imagine if we thought of it kind of like in our own minds? Moses comes back to the Lord and says, hey, I gave them all of the information. They said that they're on board. As though God would say, wow, that's great. I'm so glad. He knows exactly what's going to happen. He knows how disobedient they will be and their ebb and flow. He knows all that's going to be taking place between now and then. This is done for the sake of accountability. That they will not be able to, at some day down the road, be able to say, well, you never told us. Oh, no, I told you in detail. In fact, from day one, I told you what I was going to do, and you guys said that you were on board. You rebelled. Everything that I had required was put in writing. That's what the law ultimately does. It demonstrates to us our offense. If you're not familiar with that, seriously, the 3rd chapter of Galatians does such a good job of explaining this. So go ahead and read that on your own. Verse 9. So the Lord said to Moses, behold, I come to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and believe you forever. So Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. Now remember, so much of what we're reading here was done deliberately this way. It wasn't secret, so that what would happen is that people would always have that visible reminder of how God did what he did. So that, again, somewhere down the road, they're never going to be able to say, well, if we had only known. Can you imagine if it was still done this way? Me, the pastor. Every Sunday morning, there's some little platform that I could go walk up on, and clouds came down. And you guys saw me go up there, and know that if you guys touched any of the scaffolding or whatever I walked up, that you were to be put to death. Would you not know that when I came down that there was something probably pretty important? Unless, of course, it was just some kind of really cool, gimmicky thing like they do in a lot of churches. But let's just assume that it was the real deal, like what we have here. I know, I can't help myself, sorry. Imagine the impact that would have on your mind and heart, that you would see something like that. Would you ever forget it? We showed up and we saw the thunderings. Notice, you'll see some of the other things that took place here. And notice the level of holiness that he requires of the people. Let's read on, verse 10. So the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them. Set them apart unto holiness. Tell them to make preparation. Consecrate themselves today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes. We're not given a lot of detail as to what that means. What is the level of their consecration? Why the washing of the clothes? There's a purity that's implied with that. But there are a few other things he's going to say too. I want them to come before me without distraction and show them that they would show themselves to me that they have taken these things seriously. Go back to them and tell them these are the levels of preparation before this day. Now, let them be ready for that third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. And you will set bounds for the people all around, saying, take heed to yourselves that you do not go up to the mountain or touch its base. So there is it's like drawing a line around it. You can go this far, do not take a step further. Well, what if we do? Glad you asked. Whoever touches the mountains will be put to death. Not a hand will touch him, but he surely will be stoned or shot with an arrow, whether man or beast. He will not live. When the trumpet sounds long, they shall come near to that mountain. What an interesting thing. First of all, that God says, do this, and if you violate, you're going to be put to death. Why not just do it by a hand or whatever else? Because that would, in the way, as we understand how the law will end up working, that direct person-to-person contact is a transferal of that same uncleanness. But notice it's not going to be that God's going to say, I'm going to strike him dead, like what happened with Uriah. Remember when he touched the Ark of the Covenant, when it jostled and he touched it, tried to keep it from falling, he, on the spot, just done, right? In this case, it was going to be done by someone else. This would make them also visibly accountable to all of these things. They would remember. So, you would figure that that's enough, right? Watch what ends up happening. So Moses went down the mountain to the people and told them to sanctify the people and sanctify the people, and they washed their clothes. And he said to the people, be ready for the third day, do not come near your wives. That means you're not having relationships, husband and wife. Again, total consecration. Nothing that would be in any way a defilement, and I won't get into the defilements. We'll get into that soon enough anyway, because it's all going to be in the law. But no such defilement of any kind, total consecration. Take 2 days to do this, and on that third day, make sure that you have done exactly what you're supposed to do. Remember that it's not like you're going to get a demerit or you're going to get a lower grade on your test. You're talking about life and death here. So it helps us to recognize that when God says something, that he's serious about this. Now let me step back for one more moment before we go on. Let us remember that the same God who gave these kinds of details, and it had the same kind of seriousness to it, please let us remember that this is the same God today. Let us make sure that we recognize that his holiness has not changed one iota. And it keeps coming up in the text over and over and over again, the perfection and the holiness of God and what he requires of us. And we should never, ever try to diminish that somehow by explaining it away in some way, which oftentimes happens. I am thankful that when I step over the line that God has given, that he doesn't have somebody bring rocks or an arrow and take me out because I've disobeyed. How about you? I know oftentimes I will have people come to me and say, the problems that are happening in my life, is it because God is treating me somehow punitively? And I'm thinking, if God treated us punitively for every time that we sin, we'd all be dead. Can I remind us of that? Same God. I am thankful for grace. I am so thankful for Jesus that everything about my imperfection was put upon him, but that should not be a convenient way for me to sidestep it and say, no big deal, it's all under grace. Goodness, that's abuse. That's my abuse if I ever have that opinion, right? Heavy stuff. So, verse 16, and it will come to pass on the third day in the morning that there will be thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountains, and the sound of the trumpet was very loud, so that the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Can you imagine being these guys if they really took it serious? Where's the chalk line? Because I do not want to step over that. Where is it? Because I don't want to make a mistake here. Now, Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. Can you imagine what this looked like? Now, to me, some extent, I find it interesting that I was reading an article that like 20,000 lightning strikes hit London recently, like in a day. It was crazy. A ridiculous lightning storm. And I just think that really got everybody's attention. They're writing about it all over the world. And I'm thinking, can you imagine if they had like a correspondent at this one on some live remote? Well, here I am at Sinai, and behind me you'll see. Can you imagine? But this is again supposed to be a way where they would recognize that this is not some trivial thing. It's not some fable. It was done in the sight of all of the people, and there was a great accountability that came with it. You would think that having seen this, they wouldn't have had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, right? We've already read how grumpy they got, complained about, the manna and then, meat and all that stuff. Did God bring us all the way out here just to kill us? And, oh my gosh, aren't we whiny people? Goodness. Well, you guys might be, So, the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai in the top of the mountain. And the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Verse 21, the Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people, lest they break through to gaze at the Lord, and many of them perish. He's already warned them, right? Now look at what Moses does. It's a good thing, right? We always want to remind God of things. But, why is this even necessary? Look at what he says. So the Lord said to Moses, go down and do this. Verse 22, also let the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. But Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, set bounds around the mountain. It's like, God, you already told us that. It's no big deal. I don't need to tell them that. Well, what does God have to say about that? So the Lord said to him, away, ! Go do this. You know the implication to that? This is God saying, you've told them and I've told them, but they're about to do what I told them not to do. Go back and warn them because I'm serious about this. If Moses had said, you've already told us to do that, and God said, okay, who knows how many people would have got wiped out because of all of the fascination. Now see, we think of 2-year-olds. Tell them not what to do, or tell them what you don't want them to do. It's the first thing that they do. We think as adults we're not the same way. Really? Look at these guys. Moses, go back down there and tell them again, I'm serious about this. So the Lord said to him, away, get down and then come up, you and Aaron with you, but do not let the priests and the people break through and come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. He did exactly what he was said to do. So he completes this cycle. Brings us to chapter 20. We will get there next week. This is the giving of the commandments. So we will look at them. Actually, next week is communion. And so we will do this the week after communion. So 2 weeks from tonight, we get to chapter 20. And this is the giving of the first part of the law. So this is just the first 10. And very interesting. And I don't know, I may get myself in a little bit of trouble. But these commandments, there's something that's kind of interesting. Do you know that one church has changed the commandments? There's one that has been changed entirely, and I'm going to show it to you and get myself in a lot of trouble. So we'll deal with chapter 20 and start to move our way through this. So Let me have the group come back up. We're a couple of minutes early. Yeah, so like 3 minutes early. Not bad, huh? Yeah, let's stand, have a closing word of prayer, and we'll close out with a song as well. Father, we do thank you for your faithfulness to us, and we thank you again for your word. There's so much that we can learn by just paying attention, hearing what you have to say. We would ask, Lord, that as we study through this book, realizing that we're reading very, very old history, there are still things, very many of them, that if we are to pay attention, that you're the God who never changes. You still call us to a sense of holiness and of separation. We would ask, Lord, that you would help us in our minds and our hearts to be attentive to that. That every day that we would be closer to you because we move further away from the things of the world. We thank you, we give to you all praise and honor, and ask that you would glorify yourself in the lives of those here. We thank you and give you praise in Jesus' name. Amen.